He's not just a rock star, he's a rock star who gives a damn. He gives a damn about education, poverty, famine, disease. He headed the punk movement, he had a wonderful band, he made young people dance. And then in 1984, he saw the absolutely ravaging images of famine in Ethiopia. And he organized a concert that the world had never seen. 16 hours of rock music across 2 continents. And he raised 150 million pounds, and he was knighted at 34. Since then, his concerns have not shifted. We spoke earlier about people whose politics don't change for 30 years, and that becomes suspicious. But here's a rock star whose politics hasn't changed since 1984, and he continues to be concerned. He continues to be Sir Bob Geldof. Please invite him, speaking with Tarun Tejpal.
Hello. So Bob, shall we set a ground rule which we both believe in, that profanity goes really well with intelligence and good work?
No, only if you're Irish.
It's also true if you're a Punjabi.
Same thing.
Same thing, yes. I think that's the Punjabis make more money than the Irish do. We'll take a leap right at the deep end. I mean, it's been a life of breakneck activism for you. And I know you famously said, I don't like to shut up, I like to keep speaking. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it means that you don't have to ask me questions.
There we go. So I'll ask you the first question and I'll sit back and listen. And you know, you've been a pro-nuclear activist, an anti-Euro activist, a pro-single-father activist. But the one thing that's defined your life, even more than the music, is probably the work you've done in Africa. And I just want you to take us through the story of that first engagement with Africa and how it's progressed over 30 years, because I know you've never completely ever disengaged from Africa, coming back very strongly in 2004 with Tony Blair and the African Commission. But start us from the beginning. What got you into Africa, and why has it become such a leitmotif in your life?
Well, if I could just go back to the first part, I don't want to gloss over the pro-nuclear thing. It's nuclear with reservations, the same reservations everybody has. If it can be safe, if we can find some mechanism for decommissioning the waste fuel, then it seems to me that not only is it a benefit to science, but a net benefit to people who are dependent on other countries for their fuel. And there has to be some way we can avoid conflict by being energy sufficient ourselves. India will have a problem having its own energy needs, as we heard earlier. And one of the reasons you developed nuclear energy was specifically to deal with this. In that instance, I'm pro-nuclear. But in every other way, I share the reservations of everybody else. In terms of the anti-Euro, I'm only anti-Euro in as much as that I don't see how it makes sense for one free market of 2 completely economies in disequilibrium. A currency will fall over. And so when this was being suggested in the UK, I do business as well, and I can't see how that works. I just don't understand it. And why would you willingly vote for disequilibrium in your country? I'm Irish, so I vote in Ireland as well. So I voted for the euro in Ireland for political reasons, because Ireland, a tiny island, can move away from the shadow of its huge, giant cultural and economic neighbour, the UK, and move around it for the first time and be an equal voice in Brussels. So in Ireland, I voted for it politically. In England, I voted against it on economic grounds, because England has a completely separate economic history to the continent of Europe. And so for that, and if things change, as Galbraith said, when facts change, I tend to change my opinion. And
Keynes.
The same would be true. Keynes said
that was John Keynes. Yeah.
And in terms of a father, which I know you're going to come to, I have 4...
We'll talk about that later. One is, of course, you keep saying you're Irish, but all of England seems to keep claiming you periodically. Weren't you named one of the 100 greatest living Englishmen some time ago?
100?
Weren't you part of 100?
Not 5? Come on! You know.
And I was told there was a survey which had 25% of the respondents confusing your quotations with those from the Bible. Is that right?
Yeah. It's easy. You can just hear.
That's
Christ talked a lot about the euro and nuclear power. It's easy to confuse it, you know.
Let's go to Africa. I mean, that's kind of a big piece of your life. Tell us, how did you get engaged with Africa?
Well, the first thing to remember is that musically I came out of a period in the mid-70s when rock and roll had ceased to be about anything to do with normal life. The rock stars had become big blown entities. It was about the height of their hair, their platforms, the length of their limousines, how many rooms they had in their house. And it was an intense political period in especially the UK and America with Thatcher and Reagan. And it was pre that. And the economy was driving into the wall. There was no future for that generation at all. So out of this milieu came a group of people, we weren't known to each other, who decided to make music that was about things, about actual life. And I'm sure you know some of their names: the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Ramones, the Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, and us from Ireland, the Boomtown Rats. And so I wanted to use music to do things. And I was a 60s kid, and we didn't have much money in the family. My mum was dead. She died when I was 7. My dad sold towels around the countryside of Ireland, so he didn't have money. But any money he had, he paid for my sisters and my education. And I was aware that, you know, my friends had other stuff, and I was embarrassed, stupidly, for us, and I wanted what they had. And I began reading Dickens and Steinbeck and Studs Terkel, the great Chicago journalist, and Woody Guthrie, the balladeer, his biography, Bound for Glory. And I was talking earlier, I suppose you could say this is books about the romance of poverty, except poverty isn't romantic at all. What these people were trying to do was to expose these lives as normal and heroic. But there is no heroism either. And at 13, at 11, I started listening to rock and roll, the one station in Europe, and I heard other voices talking of other possibilities, other universes. And these were famous voices now: Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Pete Townsend, Mick Jagger. And of course, like people of my generation, to me they were talking of change, the necessity of change, the inevitability of change. And to me, they provided me with the language of change, which was rock and roll, and the platform for that change, which was rock and roll. And because of Dylan, I started reading James Baldwin and what was happening in South Africa. So myself and my friend Mick Foley, we started the anti-apartheid movement in Dublin at 13 because the rugby team, the South African rugby team, were coming to play and there was a cultural boycott. So we organised a march to try and stop it, and we did. And there were other groups, but we were in the South Dublin area. And I began to see that you could engage and you were not powerless. The individual is not powerless in the face of something that appears overwhelming and tyrannical. So my dad wasn't there, my mum was dead, so I did no work. I didn't do any homework. I'd come home and turn on the radio and read a book. And I stopped going home then at about 15. I just would take the bus into Dublin. And there I saw alive in front of me people that I'd been reading about in South Africa or the US, homeless, men who'd lost their families, hookers who are not like the glamorous call girls of Hollywood, but thin, whey-faced, pinched, beaten up girls. and they're brutish pimps. And I began working with a crowd called the Simon community, which sounds religious but isn't. And we started getting vegetables from the grocers in the evening, and at 2 in the morning, the bakers, when they started baking, would give us bread. And we'd make a big fire in the middle of Smithfield Market, and these people would gather round. And the stories they told me were much more interesting than what I was learning in school, or not learning. And we made the soup, and then we put the soup in flasks, and we went and did our rounds, and some of these schizophrenic bag ladies, bag men. And that interested me. And I left school, and I had no academic qualifications whatsoever, so I just wandered around doing different jobs around the world. And I got lucky. I pitched up in a rock and roll band, and I could talk about these things through music. And bizarrely, they became hit records. So, actually not bizarrely, it's pure genius. Yeah. Yeah. But, and then 10 years later, you know, we did the world, we did the stadiums, we did the drugs and the girls, and it was great. I mean, there is no better job for a young man. So every young man in this room, or young girl, do it. You know? And then we began to dip, which is the natural progression, unless you just remain one of the 5 bands at the top. And one night I came home aware that our new record, The Usual Excellence, of course, wasn't doing well. And I didn't know what was going to happen to me and my wife and my first baby. You know, I was worried about that, and I was worried, is this over? Was that the time in my life, and that's gone? And so all these things were in my head, and it was October in England. Fog was coming in about 4, the lights came on early, and I was miserable. And I sat down and turned on the telly. It was 6 o'clock. Those of you who know the UK knows the BBC. Everyone watches the BBC at 6. There were only 2 channels at the time, so everyone was watching. And they gave 10 minutes, which is a long time in a half-hour news show, to what we now call the Great African Famines. And it was an extraordinary piece of journalism. I mean, they've won every award now, but Michael Burke was the journalist, and Mohammed Amin, the Kenyan photographer, was the photographer. And Burke stumbled, bizarrely, he was doing another story, and he stumbled upon this field of people in a place called Korum in North Ethiopia. And there were 350,000 people in this field, in their togas and ripped and torn, who had just come to that place to sit and die. I mean, extraordinary. Why they came there was no reason. Some just were escaping the droughts, and they just landed there. Now, it was the middle of the longest-running war of the 20th century, which was the Ethiopian Civil War. And Burke hardly spoke. He was so enraged. And when he did speak, it was les mots justes. He spat out words of deep anger and shame. And Moa means photography. At first it was huge, this vast space. Burke called it biblical. And then, of course, the pitiless cyclops eye of the subjective camera focused on these individual men, women, and children. And especially the children. I mean, there is an image. I've been millions of times, and I've seen things, and I know some of you have seen them also, things no human should ever have to see. But one image remained of a little girl, though you wouldn't know if she was human. She was like something from Mars, you know, huge head, no body. And she was dying, this dad. And suddenly they weren't exotic objects from Africa, from the feudal period with togas. Suddenly this was a father. And he'd lost all his other children and his wife, and he'd managed to get to Korum. And he held his child in his arms, and she was about to die on camera in terrible pain, terrible agony. Hunger, you die in agony. It's not you just die. And my wife was crying. I mean, not sobbing, but just tears. And our little girl of 9 months was between us, and I was just staring at this screen, enraged but silent. And I just thought you can do something about this. Most people can put their hand in their pocket, and do put their hand in their pocket, and they put $1 or €1 or £1 or some rupees in, and it's the most they can do. And we forget how powerful charity is. We almost think it's like when somebody is charitable, you go, well done, well done. And it's sort of the English expression, a bit naff almost, certainly in the UK. I mean, you can almost not say the word without postmodern quotes around it. We have to say charity like it's some American joke sort of thing. What it actually is one individual person seeing the misery of another human being and saying, let me give you a hand here, dude. Let me help you up. Now, if we lose that, if we really lose that, forget spirituality or religion, just the humanity of it. If we lose that natural instinct, then something inside us withers and dies. So I got my friend who was having a lot of hits in a band called Ultravox Major, and I called him at the TV show where my wife worked, and he said, well, let's get together. I'll do something now, you do something, let's see if it works. So we put together a song, and because I was unsure whether I'd have a hit, I got my friends from 10 years in rock and roll to record a little Christmas song. And the model I was using was the one I'd learned when I was a kid of Bob Dylan's and John Lennon's declamatory political statements. Very, very simple, you know, happy Christmas, war is over, give peace a chance. These simple things, the times are changing. Like a broadsheet, which is an Irish tradition of broadsheet songs. And they sang it. And what I'd forgotten was that everybody watches this media world of mono channels. And everyone had seen this in the UK and felt sick of themselves and what we had got to, and enraged and ashamed as I was. And suddenly this tiny piece of plastic, I thought it would make £100,000, I'd give it to Oxfam. Suddenly every single man, woman, child, infant was buying this. They were lining up in supermarkets. They were lining up at Fortnum and Mason's, you know. There was a butcher shop in Plymouth, and it was Christmas, you know, cold. We eat turkey there is our traditional Christmas thing, and the butcher shop had got the turkeys and the goose and the pigs and the Band-Aid record in the shop. And people were buying their turkey. They were buying 40 singles and giving back 39. I was giving you the single, you were giving me the single. And I was freaked out, you know. What? You know, now what? And so, unfortunately, the media then comes to me and says, what are you doing next? So I said, nothing, I've done it. That's the most I can do. He said, no, you're the story now.
And that was £8 million was raised from that one single. That
was it. Then the Americans called and said, Harry Belafonte, who's this old Marxist, he called me and he said, hey, Geldof. He goes, what's a Brit kid like you? And I said, Harry, I'm Irish. Same fucking thing, you know. He said, why aren't we doing it? And I said, you can do it, Harry, you know. I mean, one, I was very flattered. He's this folk legend. And I said, you know, get Michael Jackson that. So an hour later, hey, Bob, it's Michael. I said, and so we went to America and we did We Are the World, which was written by Michael, and, you know. And I went to Africa then.
Just before you go down, Bob, a little. So in all this time, between the first recognition through the BBC program, Band-Aid, and the success of the single, and the move towards the big Live Aid concert, you hadn't been to Africa yet?
No, never.
Okay.
And but you know, when I went, I mean, I was overwhelmed by what I saw. I mean, any person would be. You can see it on television, but you don't smell it, you don't touch it. Terrible. And
so, I mean, tell us about Live Aid. So, how you were dealing with Live
so
Aid?
once we'd done Band-Aid in USA for Africa, it seemed, once I was there, I saw that hunger, famine, lack of education, lack of health are only symptomatic of something. They're symptomatic of an empirical, singular condition, and that's called poverty. And poverty is political and economic. It is soluble because it's empirical. There is no need, and it is against our interests to have poor people. It is ridiculous that poverty should exist. Really, I mean, and to make the point, the world was so unbalanced up until 2007, where you had 50% minimum of the world living on less than $2 a day. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot live on less than $2 a day. You simply can't do it. And we kept half of the world in this penury for our own purposes. But those purposes are preposterous in an economic sense. It makes no sense. If the poor can produce, as we've seen in China, then they lift themselves out of poverty. One of the great miracles of the 20th century, which was celebrated finally at the end of the 20th century, was Indian democracy. That it should function at all is extraordinary and brilliant. And one of the first great triumphs of the 21st century is that the Chinese have pulled 400 million people out of extreme poverty. That is an amazing achievement, and they're now going, as we know, hell for leather to pull the other 850 million out, because if they don't, they'll have social disequilibrium.
Just to put a pointer on that, Bob, you're absolutely right about everything you said. In India, it's not even $2. Close to 500 million people live on less than $0.50 a day.
I know. I mean,
that's
but
the number for
how
India.
is that in the interest of this country? You know, you will have, with modern communication, awareness, groups gathering together, and unless you rush to deliver this social justice, you will have proper, serious problems. As I suggested on stage, listening to every speaker
we're having
here.
more than a share of them, even as we speak, all across the country. We have 1 million mutinies going on across the country, and the reasons are, as you spell them out, it is a failure of political and economic vision. I mean, there is nothing else to it. There is no reason for it to be. But to get back to Africa and Live Aid, so what happened then with your own engagement with Africa?
Once I saw it was political and economic, I understood that the lobby that was raised by these records could be generated around the planet. And once you had that lobby, you could then, on an equal footing, talk to... It was legitimate that I could go and talk to politicians. In my back pocket, I would have 1 billion people. So Live Aid was two things. People think it was a cultural event. On one level, yes, but it was never that for me. For me, it was always the raising of a political lobby for change. It was a political event. So I thought we can bring the USA for Africa and the Band-Aid bands together in a single concert over 2 continents, 1 concert. And then we could display that to the world, hopefully. And I didn't think there was a problem with that, but the technicians did. I assumed there was enough stuff up there, you know, to show everyone this. And again, the BBC were fantastic. I mean, the image of the BBC is people with shorts and sandals with socks is exactly right. They go around saying, now, if we do this and that, you know. But they're great technicians. And we did Live Aid, and I think 1.8 billion people saw it at that time. And we raised then 150 million pounds. It's much more than that now. But with that, we were able to begin.
And is it true that you went on air shouting and belaboring audiences, to get the fuck out and put their money down for it. Yes?
Yes.
Tell us about that quickly. You said don't go to the pub. Go and put the money down for Africa.
In Britain, it was a beautiful day. I mean, just hot and sunny. And I was going to Wembley Stadium, and I was very nervous. I thought I had no contracts with any of these bands because when George Harrison did Bangladesh concerts, very little of the money went to Bangladesh. It got eaten up by lawyers and, you know, record companies and that. And George said to me, watch out for the fucking lawyers, Bob. You know, so I said, got it, George. You know, the Beatles, thank you. You know, and so I didn't have lawyers. I just called the bands and I just said, no movies, no videos, no records, nothing. 15 minutes, do your hits, leave. And they did that. I mean, the bands were great. But people were so enraptured, the romance of the idea that they were talking, finally, bizarrely, human beings in a dialogue, not in a monologue, with each other everywhere. I mean, Tierra del Fuego, Vladivostok. And it's weird, when I walked out on stage for my bit, suddenly I wasn't the organizer, I was the pop singer with my friends. And thinking that somebody in Shanghai or Santiago is there watching that's very strange, you know. And but I was aware suddenly of the romance of this. And for me, it was all the organizational continuum. And I was afraid that people in this beautiful day, they had their TVs out in the garden, and they were there with their beer and watching the greatest artists in my field ever assembled. They loved this, and nothing was happening. So I freaked out, and I ran up to the top of Wembley Stadium, up to the gantries, and I burst into the television room, and this DJ was saying, hey, you know, why don't you write to us? Write? It's 1985. People don't write anymore. They do, well, there was no mobiles. Maybe there was, but they were this size at that point, you know. And and I said, fuck writing, you know. Just, you know, please don't go to the pub today, you know, please, you know. Just send us
the
money. And there was this crash of money came from everywhere. I mean, Nepal, I don't know how much Nepal gave, but they're one of the poorest countries in the world, but pro rata in the world, they were third or fourth.
Fantastic.
You know, so it was...
If they give us a few more minutes, which I'm sure they will, tell us, 8 years later, and all the engagements with Africa, there isn't time to go into the Commission for Africa, the Tony Blair Initiative, the Glen Eagles Convention, all that has happened. 28 years later, do you think that fundamentally all transformation in this world will not be overnight, but will be, in a sense, a process, and people like you or others like you have to aid that process, catalyze that process? You know, there is this sense of the radical, and which you know, the rhetoric of even rock and roll is about that, about the instant transformation and the instant change. But actually change often, I mean, one of the greatest things I feel about my own country, India, is the reason we are spectacular in conception is because the founding fathers backed not overnight transformation and revolution, but actually processes. They put into place hundreds of important documents and institutions that ensured we would continue to be on the track towards what they dreamt of. Yeah. A great egalitarian country, a great democracy. Is 28 years later, with all the struggles in Africa and the problems all unresolved or some resolved, is that a belief that has come to you?
Well, the interesting thing about what you say is that in many of the African countries, where incidentally corruption is far less than Asia, even though people think it's entirely corrupt. Corruption in Southeast Asia is about 11%. In China, it's about 13% of GDP. Pan-African, it's about 6 to 7%. 6 to 7% too much, but bearable. You can't develop beyond that. And the interesting thing about India is that you did have founding fathers who had founding institutions and documents. That's not true of the African states, and that's a problem. But equally, processes can be corrupted very simply. And it seems to me, listening to this forum over the last 3 days, that you're so profoundly affected. Everyone keeps saying it's from the top right down to the bottom. Everyone's corrupt. That's not fair. If you're at the bottom, the only way to progress is through corruption. Were it fair, you'd progress further. But if you're arrested and the only for nothing, and the only way you can get out is by bribery or influence, you know somebody and that gets, then you're out. It's from the top the corruption happens. It's the only bottom-down power that is given out, and that's a serious problem. And I know you're trying to deal with it, not least in this forum, but you will not move forward. You will not until it begins to be unpicked, and it's the same is true of Africa. But there can be instant change, but not from individuals or processes. We've seen with new technologies, change happened almost instantly.
But I mean, that's another discussion, but we've seen already how the Arab Spring has come apart. Fueled by technology, but that'll happen here. Stymied by older pulls and pressures.
But those pressures will break.
But the point I was trying to make is 28 years later, do you believe that actually there's the process that you've got to keep pushing and hope for the best in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Gleneagles 2005 was the last effective G7. We no longer need a G7. The G20 is ineffective. We're in a G0 world. And it'll be regional and competitive. That's not great. And there'll be pivot states, but there's one pivot continent, and that's Africa. Because all of us, literally all of us, for the first time ever, need that place, because that's the motherland of all resources. We are in the middle of a food crisis in the world. It's impeding the recovery in the West. It keeps people starving here. The climate change issue must be addressed on a global level. But in Africa is the remaining 60% of arable land.
That's right.
So whether we like it or not, we're going to go there just for that alone. And it's amazing to me that having, not because of me, but because of the world needing Africa, the Chinese in particular, that the political and economic position that I thought about in 1984. After Gleneagles, when the West cancelled debt and when they doubled aid to Africa, two other things happened. Massive Chinese investment and the arrival of mobile phones in a very unpopulated
We played a little role in that, mobile telephones.
Yes, you did. Bharti telephones, they made 27 billion out of East Africa so far. Well done, India, you know. But India just drops into Africa. You don't even see it. It just drops in. China drops into Africa. One desert, one, is the size of the United States. North Africa is Europe. It's giant. After the war, there was only 11 cities of 100,000 people.
In Africa.
And so you didn't have hubs of development. Now with the mobile phone, there's virtual infrastructure. And they talk and trade and communicate. So the result of ending the debt, doubling the aid, massive Chinese and Indian investment, and the mobile phones, the result is of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the planet today, 7 are African, and of those 7, 5 are the countries that we were talking about back in 1985.
Quickly, if Shoma gives us another 3 minutes, I just want to ask you, take you back from Africa, the big world, to something very personal. I know you've lived through a very, very deep domestic crisis over the last 15-odd years, with first the separation from your wife of 20 years, Paula, the death of Paula, and the bringing up of your 3 daughters, and you've also been a very staunch activist of the single fatherhood regulations and rules. Tell us a little bit about that period before we close. How difficult was that? Because I know you said at one point you drew up a list. You were in a state of such depression that you drew up a list to understand if there are any reasons to live. And you could only, at the end of the day, crystallize one reason, and that was your daughters. You know, what was that period, and how does the rest of your life kind of cohere around that?
Well, as you said, I mean, that list suggests a terminal desperation. I love my wife very much, and she left me, and that happens. But I didn't think it was going to happen in my wildest dreams, and it happened like that. And so what I didn't understand was that I'd lost the person I loved. I could intellectually understand that she didn't love me anymore. I understood that, but I found it difficult. I mean, you empty. And but what I couldn't really understand is why, because she didn't love me anymore, did I lose my home. I don't just mean my house. That's a physical thing. But I lost my home. And I go back to the fact that I didn't really have a home. My mum was dead when I was 7. My dad traveled around the country, so he wasn't at home. I had 2 elder sisters. One got married quickly. The other was the school swat, we say in Britain, you know, the one who studied, so she didn't come home till 8. So I was kind of by myself. So finally I had a home with 3 girls, and that went. And my children went. Why? What had I actually done that the state can say, and because of this personal dilemma, crisis, that suddenly here you are, 1 minute you're dying to come home to your home and your love and everything that is the best of you, and next minute you're in this flat with no one, and you're allowed to see your children for 2 hours every 14 days. These people who were sitting on my knee that, you know, I was bathing and telling bedtime stories to, suddenly, no. And I didn't understand that. Why should that be? And it was that drove me to despair. And, you know, I couldn't function at all. I mean, the expression is unmanned. And it's a good expression. I didn't want to shag. I couldn't shag, you know. I hated women. I hated them, all of them, you know. I mean, I was going mad. And I know I was going mad. And my male friends came around, because I couldn't stand to see my female friends. They were all horrible. And you know, the girls, when they come around, when they have the same problem, they talk these things through. Guys, when they come around, they just sit there going,
What finally pulled you out of it, Bob?
you know, but, you know, that's good. It works, that sort of silence, you know. And being me, I began to, once I'd made my list of why, I used to wake up and I had been crying in my sleep. And you wake up in physical pain. I mean, I thought a broken heart was an expression. But actually, you know, the pain of it, like, you know, the physical pain and that. So I would wake up with my tears, with my cheeks wet from just crying while I was asleep. And I thought, this has to end. I can't do this for another year. And it was worse because outside in the house there were 40 or 50 paparazzi, and there was a big circus, it was a soap opera. And I couldn't leave the house, and I had to keep the curtains drawn, yada, yada, yada. And so I made the list. Why should I stay alive? You know, the pain will stop, the emptiness will stop, you don't need a home, you don't need this, you don't need that. And then the other side is, why should you stay alive? The girls. So I called my friend because I knew I was on the edge of something, and he just said, stay where you are. And he came around and he really spoke to me. And from that point, I really began to question why fathers get disenfranchised when a domestic situation happens in our part of the world. I don't know about here. And I joined the Cambridge University Family Socio-Legal Research Group. And you know, these were all experts in this, and I was in the courts trying to see my kids. I wanted to be with them 50% of the time, to have the privilege of bringing them up, because that's why I had them. And the courts wouldn't allow it because they believe that it is the natural instinct of the woman to be a mother. That's true, but it's also the natural instinct of a dad to be a father. And there is, you know, there's no... And, you know, I went into the empirical studies of people who were brought up by their dads, like me. And there is no evidence at the age of 21 that an individual has been brought up by their mother or father. There is no difference. They can't deduce one. And so the courts, being white, middle-age, middle class, coming from a certain sector, can't see beyond what they've inherited. And I don't blame the law, Because the law is always going to lose. Society moves ahead in a broad sweep, suggesting its own agenda, its own moral parameters. And the law runs around behind like a sort of legal pooper scooper, scooping up the shit that, society leaves behind it and trying to draw legalities around our moral parameters. It's always going to lose, and in that loss, in that competition is where lawyers make their money. And so I was in court, and all I wanted was her to have them for half of the time and me to have them for half of the time, and I would pay for a nanny, a consistent nanny all the time, etc., etc. I moved so I was near the school and in front of the park where I still live. And unfortunately, as you probably know, what was happening over on her side became catastrophic. She went into a long decline with her new lover, and eventually he committed suicide and she died of a drug overdose. And so it is like a soap opera. I hate to say it's Shakespearean because it sounds too grand for a personal situation, but I can't think of anything more. And so they had a little girl, and so yes, I did eventually get the children 50% of the time, but I was more and more worried about what was happening in their house. And eventually it was so chaotic that the children came to me. And then when their mum died, I had 4 little girls. And now they're all grown up, and that's it.
That's a great story. I told every friend of mine who was coming here and heard that Bob Geldof would be playing, I told every friend of mine, I said, forget about hearing him play. You got to come here to hear him talk. And all I can say is, it's a great privilege that we've got someone who has talent, who has had privilege, and who's used all of it to this incredible, great effect in the wider world. A standing ovation, please, for Bob Geldof. Come on. Yeah.
Please. Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, Bob.
Bye.